Our first series of lessons was based around the concept of air resistance, and the students were to design, build, and test their own parachutes. We began by probing the students' knowledge about air, gravity, and air resistance, and discovered that they held quite a few misconceptions. In order to make the lesson interesting and relatable to the students, we spent some time discussing parachutes and skydiving. I found that connecting the topic to something the students had knowledge of helped them to express their own ideas and also piqued their curiosity. To address some of the misconceptions and scaffold learning, we designed a small experiment for the students to do, which would also hopefully help them to make decisions when designing their parachutes. We simply had each student drop a piece of paper whilst standing. Each piece of paper was dropped a different way: horizontal, vertical, or screwed up. Before the students dropped each piece of paper, we had them write down their predictions. Here's an example of some of the things the students predicted. As you can see, although most students' predictions are right, they have trouble identifying why they think that way. This is one limitation of having students write down their predictions rather than explaining their reasoning verbally. For this activity, we were following the POE model: predict, observe, and explain. Next, it was time for the students to start applying some of these concepts to their parachute designs. We spent some time discussing suitable and appropriate materials, and along with their labelled designs, students submitted a list of materials they required. We found that the students had some really creative ideas for parachutes, and we thought it was important not to question their ideas at this point. We thought it would be beneficial for students to see a variety of materials being used and the different outcomes. It was good to see students weren't looking at this activity as a competition, and I think that helped them to be more creative with their designs. In one of our readings, Drain talked about a dual-phase pedagogical approach. For Phase 1, students would complete a series of small tasks which enabled them to gather evidence and information. This information would help them with Phase 2, which is about designing and making. If I did these lessons again in a real classroom situation, I think this would be a useful approach to take, because it would scaffold students' learning and allow them to build up the knowledge and skills required to build a successful parachute. In Lesson 2, the students carried out their designs and assembled their parachutes using the materials we bought for them. Again, the students predicted what they thought would happen. Lucy dropped each parachute from the same height, whilst students observed, and then we had a discussion about why some designs were more successful than others. We talked about the different surface areas of the parachutes and how that affected the result. The length of the string used to hold the egg, the materials used for the parachute itself, and also the height which the parachutes were dropped from. One conclusion the class came to was that we should not have used eggs as a weight for the parachutes, as they were too heavy when the parachutes were being dropped from such a low height. I think our strengths lie in our ability to engage the students by fostering positive relationships and stimulating the students' curiosity. One strategy we used to do this was our discussion about parachuting. We asked students if they knew anybody who had been parachuting and watched a short video and looked at some images of parachutes before delving in deeper and looking at how parachutes work. These lessons were before we went on prac, so I think a lot of our weaknesses stemmed simply from a lack of experience and a lack of content knowledge. I know I found that although I read up on the topic, when it came to addressing some of the students' misconceptions, it was difficult to pinpoint why they were thinking that way and address them in a way that wouldn't confuse them further. I also think that we really should have done the experiment ourselves before doing it with the class, so that we would have known eggs were not a great choice as a stabiliser for our parachutes.
Science Lesson 1. The second series of lessons were based upon seed germination and photosynthesis. We created an experiment to show the growth of a seed when placed under certain conditions, and then asked the students to predict what would happen to each seed. The students had to write a few sentences, draw a picture, and then discuss with the group what they thought would happen. After each student had shared their predictions, they were required to come up with a general consensus as to what would happen to each seed. The experiment. Each student was given 3 seeds, 3 plastic cups and cotton wool. We asked each student to label the plastic cups with sun and water, sun and no water, water and no sun. The students put cotton wool and a seed in each of the plastic cups and watered the 2 that required it. They then needed to put 1 cup out of the sunlight and the other 2 cups in direct sunlight. The groups were asked to water their seeds every day and document any changes, although I have a suspicion that only 2 of the students remembered to do this. After the experiment was completed and the students had put their seeds in either sunlight or darkness, Jamie and I had a discussion with the group about what they already knew about plant growth and seed germination. We decided to create a KWL chart to document what they know, what they wanted to know, and finally, what they'd learn at the end of the topic. From this exercise, we could ascertain that the students had a basic understanding about plants, their basic structure, and how they turned CO2 into oxygen for us to breathe. The students lacked knowledge about how plants grow and why plants are important for humans. To break up the class, we then took the students outside to have a look at the school's community garden and to discuss the different types of plants that we could see and if they could name the different varieties growing in the garden. This gave the learners the opportunity to become teachers and to tell us what they already knew about the school gardens. With our group of students, it was an important break in the lesson, as you could see the engagement levels begin to drop after a block of approximately 30 to 40 minutes. The walk around outside created an easy intermission for the lesson. When coming back from our walk in the garden and looking at the plants the school had planted for Cooking Club, we began to discuss the role plants play in our everyday lives. How everything we use can be related back to some form of plants and plant growth, from the grains we make our bread with to the paper we use at school. The students were unaware of the dependency that we have with plants. When reflecting on this lesson, Jamie and I both felt that this was an improvement on our first 2 technology classes. We came into this feeling much more confident as a result of our last 5 weeks on practicum. Our strengths were the hands-on tasks where the students were engaged by active participation. We also spent a lot of time exploring our concepts as this is an important part of the E5 model. Science Lesson 2. We started the lesson asking for each student to gather their seed experiments and bring them to the group for a discussion of the outcomes. It was interesting to note that each student had varying results, which led me to believe that some were more efficient at watering their seeds than others. As a group, we compared the outcomes to the students' predictions that they had drawn up in the previous lesson. As the seed results were so different, it was harder to discuss the outcomes whilst using the seeds as evidence, as some of the seeds we were unable to explain why they had grown or why they had not grown the way they did. The students then had to draw what stage each seed had developed to, and then we talked about this as a whole group. We then moved on to talking about the photosynthesis process. The students had limited prior knowledge, so we started by showing them a simple animation of how the process worked. We then discussed the animation, and each student was asked to complete a written task and explain to us the process of photosynthesis. We used this activity as an assessment piece. This lesson was also spent going over the concepts covered in last week's lesson. We felt this was beneficial to their ability to understand the concepts. The lesson would have been more engaging if we had another hands-on activity for the group. By the end of Lesson 2, most students demonstrated the ability to identify the structural features of a plant and their purpose. All students had an understanding of what the plant needs to grow well, and they have varying knowledge and understanding of why plants are important to humans and how plants make their own food through photosynthesis.